Welcome into the Autzen Audibles Podcast. I'm Matt Bray, Eric Scopel, as always, on the show. Today, we're bringing in Jake Hedberg of BeaverBlitz.com, the beat reporter for the Beavers of 24/7 Sports. Jake, it's different. It's different conferences. Oregon players today said feels like Thanksgiving because these two teams play usually back in November, the last game of the season. Now it's the third week of the year. Just before we dive into this feels weird, right? Like talking Civil War in September.
Totally. I mean, it's a totally different perspective. I mean, it does feel like it should be, Thanksgiving, Black Friday, and college football on Saturday. But, it's third week of September. School hasn't even started for either school, I don't think. It's weird, playing a Civil War in 75-degree weather just doesn't quite sit right with me. But at least we're still getting the game in.
That's right. Trent Bray has taken over the Beaver program. OSU's off to a 2-0 start. Off season, just a bunch of stuff. Jonathan Smith leaving, player departures, new guys coming in, the Pac-12, and just trying to figure out where that goes next. Just how important has this 2-0 start been for just pure stability within the program and knowing of, hey, things are going to be okay?
Yeah, I mean, it has certainly been a crazy 13 months now in Corvallis, starting with the Pac-12 dissolving in August, jumping to November with Jonathan Smith leaves, then pretty much the entire Oregon State starting roster either graduates, transfers, or follows Smith to Michigan State. But, coming out and getting that 2-0 start was so crucial because both Oregon State and Washington State right now are both at a point where they need to win to prove to the country that they belong. And if Oregon State came out and dropped the game to either Idaho State or San Diego State, it would have told the country that, Oregon State is a lower level team. They should be in the Mountain West. And this Saturday provides Oregon State with as good an opportunity as they'll get all season to prove to the entire country that Oregon State's a Power 4 conference team.
Jake, I wanted to ask you just about Trent and this program. And it's interesting talking to Oregon players this week about how similar they feel Oregon State looks on film in terms of just what they're trying to do, maybe schematically or stylistically, and still a run heavy operation defensively. Obviously Trent's still there, so it looks similar. What kind of changes have you seen on a Saturday from what this was under Jonathan? Or does it really feel like new head coach, but a lot and a ton of, we can talk about it later, a ton of new players, basically a completely new roster, but at least what they're trying to do, does it feel very similar to what you saw the last couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, scheme-wise, I would say it's pretty similar. Defensively, especially, Trent Bray's still got his hands all over the defense. It's still a Trent Bray defense. Then Keith Hayward, who's been all over the West Coast, Washington, Oregon, SC, just spent the past season with the Raiders. He kind of brings those NFL concepts, and that kind of sprinkles in to just make this defense a little more complex for opposing offenses to figure out. And the biggest changes are on the offensive side of the ball with a new offensive coordinator who played quarterback at Oregon State. Still a relatively similar offense, whole lot of RPO stuff, run heavy, tons of pre-snap motion. It's kind of the best way I would describe it. It's like a sprinkle of a Chip Kelly offense, a Brent Brennan offense, and a Mike Riley offense. There's a whole lot of different looks. We're still figuring it out because we've only seen 2 games of it, and Oregon State hasn't really shown a whole lot on offense the past 2 days. Past 2 games, they've kind of kept the playbook vanilla just because they haven't had to bust it open to win the first or second game. But definitely expecting to see some stuff that we haven't seen on Saturday. Coach Gunderson kind of alluded to that in his presser today. He's got plays in his back pocket that didn't have to run against San Diego State, didn't have to run week 1. Playing a team like Oregon in a game that should be a lot more challenging than their first 2, to say the least, you can expect some of those looks that none of us have seen to probably come out.
And maybe the reason why they haven't had to break those out has just been their run game, led by Jam Griffin. Just a second year or a second try with Oregon State. A couple years ago, he was on the team when Oregon State last beat Oregon, and then he left the program, came back. Just why did he return, and just what's been the impact he's had in the run game?
Yeah, Jam Griffin is a fantastic back. He had a great 2022 season. Had some personal stuff come up. he had to transfer, didn't want to. He had to transfer closer to home, ended up with a season with Lane Kiffin at Ole Miss. Didn't necessarily get the touches he wanted. I think he had 7 carries all season, and came back to Corvallis. Originally was super excited about playing with Damian Martinez, who is now no longer with the Oregon State program. But Griffin stepped into that running back one. He's kind of a 1A, 1B along with Colorado transfer Anthony Hankerson. But Jam Griffin has not lost a step. I mean, he's been very impressive in the first 2 games. Ran for 160 yards on 20 carries game 1. Ran for almost 90 yards and a touchdown in game 2. And at this point, he's averaging just over 6 yards a carry, which pretty impressive through 2 games. He's a great locker room guy as well, and he's going to be the guy that Oregon State runs their offense through on Saturday.
Usually at this point in the show, we ask about newcomers for the other team, but with Oregon State, the team is so – yeah, right. It's like you could run through the whole roster up. So I wanted to ask you, like, who are the mainstays? Like, who are the guys that came back from 23 that are still kind of in, significant roles? I know Joshua Gray is probably the obvious one to me, but run through some guys that Oregon fans have probably seen the last couple of years who they'll see on Saturday.
Yeah, so the Beavers really only have 3 returning starters from last season, so 19 out of the 22 are gone. Offensive guard now, Josh Gray, who spent his first 4 seasons at Oregon State as a starter, playing left tackle. He kind of projects as a guard/center at the next level, so he elected to stay for his 6th year, and bump inside to play offensive guard. He's looked pretty good. He's the leader of the Oregon State offense. He's a 2-time team captain, overall great player to have. And then the other returning starter on the offensive side of the ball is tight end Jermaine Terry, who had 6 catches last season in kind of a blocking tight end role. Hasn't gotten a target yet. Oregon State's only thrown 1 ball to their tight ends through 2 games. So maybe we see that change on Saturday, but so far the tight ends have been a non-factor. And then defensively, the one returning starter is Jaden Robinson, who's a 7th-year player. He started his first season at corner last year and was the Beavers' best corner. Got beat for PI pretty badly last weekend, but besides that has been solid. And then back, a guy who was slated to start in 23, played a lot of football in 2022, is Skylar Thomas. He tore his ACL in the spring of last year, missed the entire season, but he's back, and he's had a really strong start. He looks stronger than he did in 22, and he's a massive safety. It's 6'2", 225. Like, you would not want to get hit by him. So those 4 are really the only experienced guys that have started games and are now back in Corvallis.
Newcomer, starting quarterback Giovanni McCoy from Idaho. Oregon's seen a lot of them in terms of preparing for Idaho 2 weeks ago. Now they've got 2 games of him at Oregon State. Just why did he win the job? He hasn't really been asked to throw it a bunch. Yeah. I think it's like 18 times a game. He's completing almost 70% of his passes, though. Looks solid, but just what's the difference for him in terms of winning the job over the other guys they had?
Yeah, so coming out of camp, we got to see the first 3 weeks, and it looked pretty neck and neck. There was really little to no separation between Oregon State's 3 quarterbacks. And then during the closed week of practice, Giovanni McCoy supposedly took a huge step forward, ended up taking the starting job. And honestly, I've been really impressed. He's done everything Oregon State's asked him to do. They're not going to ask him to throw the ball 30 times a game and throw it down the field every other snap. But he's very accurate, efficient. He makes the smart throws, pretty elusive. He's not a guy that's going to burn you with his legs, but he'll get out of the pocket and make accurate throws on the run and avoid sacks. Or he's taken 1 sack through 2 games, which is always a positive. And the one thing we haven't seen a lot of, but has looked really good, is his deep ball. He's thrown two passes longer than 30 yards. The first one was an absolute dime, 55-yard touchdown pass in week 1. And the second one was last Saturday on a flea flicker, wide open receiver, 60 yards down the field. Great throw. Receiver just dropped it. So those stats would maybe look a little better if that pass had been caught. But everything we've seen from Giovanni McCoy has exceeded my expectations. The thing is Oregon State hasn't really relied on his arm to win them a game, and I think that might end up being the case on Saturday.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the pass game because, as you kind of alluded to there, and it's pretty obvious if you look at the numbers, like 2 running backs averaging more than 100 yards per game. We talked about Griffin. You mentioned Hankerson. Those feel like kind of staple, kind of, key parts there. But in the past game, you mentioned it, like the tight ends are not really being involved. It looks like Darius Clemens, is he still dealing with an injury? And then just kind of who are these guys on the outside? Tell us more about them.
Yeah, so far Oregon State's without Clemens, who at this point the coaching staff really doesn't talk a whole lot about any injuries. So I until we see him, I wouldn't expect him on the field. Oregon State's been really rotating 3 guys on the outside with Trent Walker, who's a junior, former walk-on from Beaverton High School, and then 2 redshirt freshmen in Taz Reddix and David Wells. Trent Walker's kind of your, great route runner, great hands, possession guy. He's not going to burn you at speed, but he's definitely Oregon State's most reliable target. David Wells is a deep threat. He can stretch the field vertically. He had a big touchdown catch week 1, was a little quiet last week, expecting him to take on a bigger role this upcoming Saturday. And then Taz Reddix, who we didn't see him at all his freshman year. He was banged up. Didn't see him in the spring at all because he was still banged up, but he came out and had as good a fall camp as anyone had at Oregon State. And he went from a guy that was maybe 7th or 8th in that receiver room to probably Oregon State's number 2 guy right now. And he's a guy who's shifty after the catch. He's explosive. Hasn't really ran any deep routes yet, but excited to see what Taz can do against a higher level of competition this upcoming Saturday.
Defensively, I like everywhere, there's a bunch of newcomers, but I was pretty surprised to see 10 true freshmen or redshirt freshmen on the 2 deep, on just the defensive side alone. I guess from a big picture standpoint, just kind of the scheme really hasn't changed. What's the identity of the defense? Who are the leaders, the guys to know?
Yeah, it's a team that the strength of this defense is the secondary. And the secondary and the linebacker core, the biggest question mark has been the defensive line. The secondary is pretty experienced. I think they're legitimately 2 deep at all 10 spots, or all 5 spots. Like Oregon State could throw out any 10 guys and feel pretty strong about that secondary. The defensive line, coming into the season, they had, I want to say, 13 tackles and 13 tackles as a unit at Oregon State, and that all belonged to 1 player. So it's definitely a bunch of new faces. You'll see mainly Samisi Haluni, Jacob Schuster, Thomas Collins, who's a great pass rusher, and Savita Pomea, the former Duck. But the key of the Oregon State defense, as it has been the whole time Trent Bray has been at Oregon State, has been the inside linebackers. And the Beavers have 2 pretty good inside backers in sophomore Melvin Jordan and redshirt freshman Isaiah Chisholm. Chisholm's a guy who I think has a really, really bright future. I think he's a Sunday guy. Great in pass coverage, super athletic. Younger guy, though, so he will, make those mental mistakes. And then the Beavers have another guy who started on Saturday in place of Chisholm because Chisholm was suspended the first half because of a targeting penalty. Dexter Foster from Central Catholic. He's a guy who Trent Bray loves. He kind of fell under the radar, lower 3-star guy, but he stepped in as a true freshman and made an immediate impact. And I think you'll see a lot of him on Saturday.
Jake, let's stick on defense. And I don't know if you're like me, but when I am kind of previewing the next game, I like to look at PFF and see kind of who the guys are. And for Oregon State in particular, where there's just like a totally new team, like Thomas Collins, you mentioned him as a great pass rusher. He's, I don't know if you probably do know this, but he's PFF's number 2 ranked defensive lineman in the country right now.
Yeah.
It forced me to do some research. He's from Sweden. Like, it's a really interesting story. Like, yeah, what do we need to know about this guy? And like, is that ranking feel appropriate to what you've seen, I guess?
Yeah, it has. The one word that's been kind of used to describe Thomas Collins around the Oregon State program has been twitchy. He's a quick guy. He's a fantastic pass rusher. He had a pretty impressive offer list. I think Oregon offered him, Penn State offered him, Texas A&M offered him. So that was a big-time get. He came in last year, true freshman, and blew us away. Didn't see any time. I thought he should have. And then it was the same thing in the spring and the fall of this year, and then we saw him come out game 1 and have 7 quarterback pressures. Physically, he's not a big guy. He's 6'1", 270. Like, body type-wise, my comparison would be like a Aaron Donald type. Like, he's a shorter, he's physical, great pass rusher, still working on his run defense. But, he will command double teams left and right. I think he has a super bright future because he's just tapping into his football potential.
Looking at just this Beaver team and maybe the struggles that Oregon themselves have had, first 2 weeks. Where do you feel like there's going to be areas of success for Oregon State on Saturday? And then I guess on the flip side, just when you look at the matchups, it's like, what are the areas like they need to be really good here? Because if they're not, they're going to get torched.
Yeah, I think Oregon State's got a pretty solid run game, and granted, Ashton Jeanty is one of the best running backs in the country, if not the best, but Oregon State's got 2 pretty good backs themselves, and he was able to run pretty efficiently on Oregon, and we've seen it happen where Oregon State doesn't throw the ball, just runs the ball down Oregon's throat, and I think that's going to be the game plan. I think that's for Oregon State to be successful, that's what they're going to have to rely on. And then the other areas, I haven't watched a whole ton of Oregon film yet, but based off the box scores, it seems like the offensive line has given up a lot of sacks, and that's something that we didn't see last season. I want to say y'all gave up 5 sacks all season last year.
5 of each of the last 2 seasons, 10 total. They're already at 7.
They're at 7 through 2 games, and that's an area where a guy like Thomas Collins or an outside backer and Pico Taylor, who has 2 sacks already, those guys could come out and make a big impact. On the flip side, I think Oregon's run game is going to be the key to this game. I mean, Oregon State's pride themselves as a run-stopping team in the past, and they've done a pretty good job of it the past two games. They have not seen a back like Jordan James this season, and this is a younger, inexperienced defensive line. Granted, Oregon's had their offensive line struggles, but Oregon State's kind of an unknown up front. They played 2 games against lesser quality competition, and they've done good against the run, but again, haven't faced a guy like Jordan James. And I feel like Oregon could exploit that matchup, and Jordan James could run wild.
Yeah, and part of the reason I asked about Collins is because, as you touched on, Oregon's offensive line's been it's been tough. I mean, and those listening here aren't going to be they're just frustrated right now. There's kind of lack of certainty. So I'm with you in terms of like that feels to me really imperative for Oregon as well. And just on the flip side of like if Oregon's offensive line, they need to take a step forward this week. Okay, last one we've got for you here is just one on like what do you expect the environment to be like? Because if there's ever a year for there to be, and there's always animosity and bad blood. This is a heated rivalry for a reason. But with everything that's gone on the last year, and with I'm sure there's a sense of like pointing the finger at Oregon for putting Oregon State in the circumstances. Like, what kind of environment do you think Oregon is walking into? Like, what do you expect Reser to be like on Saturday?
Hostile. I wouldn't expect the Ducks to be too welcomed into Corvallis, especially Atticus Sappington. I feel like he might get some he might have a long afternoon. But there are certainly people in Corvallis, a lot of people in Corvallis that feel like Oregon State was left behind, and we don't really know the whole story, but obviously Oregon State fans see Oregon leaving the conference and they automatically point their finger at that. And, I feel like it's always hostile when Oregon State goes to Autzen or Oregon comes to Reser, but I think it's just going to be amplified this year. It'll be interesting to see how emotional the players get on both sides. We've seen it get chippy in the past, in 2021, for example, and I do wonder if some of that kind of boils over, just the frustration on Oregon State's side from being left behind, and maybe Oregon's frustration from not having the best first 2 weeks that they expected. It is going to be interesting. I'm excited to see it because I have pretty high expectations of the atmosphere.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. Last time Oregon went to Reser, it was an exciting back and forth game.
Yeah.
That, from an Oregon State perspective, was probably an awesome, one of the better endings in a long time. Oregon players have talked about how much that still stings, and we're going to reopen those wounds and those emotions on Saturday afternoon. Jake, thanks for coming on the show, man. We really appreciate your time, and you can go to beaverblitz.com to get more coverage of Oregon State and his work leading up to this game. Thanks a lot for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate you having me on.